The church smelled like lilies and old wood, the kind of fragrant hush that made every small sound feel sacred. Sunlight threaded through stained glass and painted the aisle in slashes of red and blue. Beatriz tightened her fingers around the bouquet until the stems dipped, then forced them to stillness when she felt her hand tremble. Behind the veil, makeup held, hair pinned into the exact shape they'd practiced, she listened to the room breathe. Uncle Hugo's throat clearing, the soft rustle of programs, her father's shoes shifting on the tile, the organist hitting a chord that made something inside her falter and then steady. She could feel the cameras. No, the cameras were lenses, the guests were eyes. And between them and the altar, she had rehearsed 1,000 small, gracious moves. This day was the story she had been stitching for years. The scheduling of vendors, the spreadsheets, the conversations that ended with, "We'll make it beautiful." It had a timeline, a rhythm. It had guarantee, so she had thought. Her phone lay in the crook of her thigh, a negligible weight. She had told herself in the weeks leading to this hour that she would not look, that it would betray that moment, that any interruption would crack what they had built. Then, during the procession, as the bridesmaids dipped into a practiced curvature of smiles, as her father put his hand on hers, steady, strong, her screen lit for the briefest moment beneath the veil, a single notification. She had time enough, in the 3 steps between the first kneel and the second, to tell herself not to, and then the vibration threaded up her spine like an alarm. The message was impossible in its economy. 3 words, the sort of casual brevity that belonged in late-night apologies and last-minute cancellations. "Sorry, I can't." Sound and color fell away. The organ swelled and became a distant thing, like weather beyond a window. The priest's voice continued. The guests lunged forward in the motion of expectation, but Beatriz's world narrowed to those 3 words on a small screen. Her breathing hitched. Raphael, her fiancé, the man whose name would be spoken from the altar and printed in the thank you cards, had sent 2 words and a futility. Around her, phones angled like tiny suns, bright and intrusive. A camera clicked near the front pew. Someone's whisper turned into murmurs, and then into a low, spreading sound, consternation, confusion, that traveled across the church like an approaching tide. The sound had no malice. It had the curious, hungry energy of people who had been given something unexpected to witness. Beatriz let the moment broaden, a slow motion she had no intention of stepping out of. Memories sifted. Raphael at the table in the small apartment when he had first suggested they move in together, the way his hand had slid confidently through hers, the ring he'd chosen with more care than the many coffee runs he'd made for her during tight projects, the nights when they had mapped a future and named its rooms. None of that, in that narrow plaza of time under the veil, cushioned the bluntness of the message. Her father, standing beside her, tightened his grip. She heard his breath turn quick and small, not his voice, but his presence, saying, "What? Don't humiliate yourself. Don't give him the satisfaction." She wanted to say something fierce, to stand and throw the bouquet like a sentence, but her knees were steady. Her chest, the place that had held excitement for months, suddenly felt raw and exposed. Then, as if cleaving the crowd in 2, a movement from the back pew. Rodrigo Tavares stood. He was not supposed to be at her wedding. He had RSVP'd with a perfunctory "congratulations" on the card weeks before, an elegant scrawl that had amused her more than pleased. He was Rodrigo Tavares, the man whose office had the view to make a whole city feel like background. He was spare and well-tailored, the sort of person who seemed made of decisions. She had never expected him on a Sunday in a small-town church. He moved with an economy that made the world pay attention. He left his seat, walked down the center aisle, and when he reached the end of the pew nearest her family, he leaned in, his voice too low for anyone else to pick up. His breath brushed the side of her ear. The words landed like an irrevocable choice. Pretend I'm the groom. They were not theatrical. They were not a joke. They were a proposition. Urgent, practical. The phrase sat between them, underlining the shapes of every possible escape and every possible humiliation. Beatrice's first reaction was outrage. This man, her boss, had no right to step into the worst tableau of her life and offer himself as a prop. Her second reaction, quicker, was the recognition of the audience still waiting. Cameras angled, phones held, relatives whose sympathy might catalyze into gossip. The third, quieter and more dangerous, was relief. Relief at having someone else present who could make the scene continue without her being dragged into the abyss of embarrassment. She could almost hear the calculus. Step down, let them file out in measured pity, have a story to tell that would ricochet for months. Or accept the absurd offer, stage the wedding, and then deal with the rest later. Legal untangling, explanations. Which life would feel worse? To stand in the aisle and be the subject of a myth, or to sit at the head table and pretend the worst had not happened at all? Rodrigo's gaze was cool. The rest of his face remained a practiced mask. He had not smiled, but there was a steadiness in him that seemed to promise containment.
"We get through this now," he said, and there was no judgment in his mouth, only an assessment of variables. "We get you through now." Beatrice swallowed. She considered the heat of humiliation and the cold calculation of ritual. She saw her father's small, taut face. She thought of Julia, the one friend who had come at dawn to help pin the veil, who had whispered about forever in a buoyant voice. She thought of Raphael's 3 words and the way they left her dangling. "No," she said, first because she had to speak against the impulse to refuse being acted upon. But her voice was thin. The whisper of her own name from her father, Bia, was a small command to survive. She felt the presence of every guest watching the equation she, and by extension, Rodrigo, were about to solve. "You decide," Rodrigo said. It wasn't an order. It was a fact. That steadied her more than it should have. Even in his offer, he reminded her that the choice was hers. That line, more than anything, held the moral center of the moment. He could facilitate, but he could not take away the decision. She looked at the officiant, Father Martin, whose expression had shifted from ceremonial calm to puzzled alarm. He was an older man, bespectacled, someone with a pastoral instinct that argued for mercy. Rodrigo leaned into him, gestures quiet, persuasive. He explained, rapidly but politely, that the intended groom had left, and that the bride wished not to be humiliated, that the marriage license had been obtained, and, if necessary, the ceremony could be performed with a temporary performance of vows, and that anything legally irregular would be legally remedied afterward. He spoke in a way that suggested logistics rather than scandal. He offered a promise that an attorney would be retained immediately, that no deception of signatures would be attempted, that the goal was dignity. Father Martin hesitated. Behind him the congregation stirred, some exchanging perplexed looks. Was it a scene? A scandal? Others simply observing the strange orchestration of adults trying to piece together a real human crisis. He surveyed Beatrice as if waiting for her counsel. All eyes, for the first time, rested plain and demanding on her. Beatrice stepped forward. She lifted the veil and set her jaw. "No grandstanding," she said. "No lies that can't be fixed. If we do this, it's a temporary arrangement to reclaim the room, to let everyone leave without making a story for them. We will sign what we must, but we will get counsel right after. I will not let anyone make me into a spectacle." She heard her voice, and it sounded like an edict. It felt like ownership. That small, precise insistence, that every action would be reversible, that she would control the terms, became the hinge. Rodrigo inclined his head. "Agreed," he said. "We make it an act.
We also make it official to prevent the tabloids from printing a lie about you. I'll have legal counsel here within the hour." It was enough.
Father Martin's shoulders eased. He briefed a line of bridesmaids and groomsmen who turned pale and then focused, and the organist found a quieter hymn that felt like cover. At the front of the church, under the carved crucifix, Beatriz stood, and Rodrigo stood opposite her, both of them performing a role that the world would not have conceived in the same way if not for the indignity they'd witnessed. The vows were truncated, rehearsed into a script that protected more than it revealed. Beatriz spoke phrases that had once been private and now tasted like thin paper in her mouth, to have and to hold, and she felt them land without the promised resonance. When Rodrigo recited his lines, there was a precision to him that made each word feel deliberate, as if he were placing them in a glass case so the world could not throw anything more dangerous at her. They exchanged what the assembled guests later called a kiss, a polite brush, the barest touch of lips, enough to furnish the image and not enough to seduce a rumor into becoming a narrative of real passion. The reception that followed was an exercise in plausible normalcy. People faked normal smiles with the aplomb of professionals. The cake was cut. There were toasts that stuttered and stopped and then moved forward with a graceless bravery. Cameras flashed. A neighbor recorded a shaky clip that would spin online. Julia squeezed Beatriz's hand and mouthed an apology that meant, "I'm so sorry, and I'm here," all at once. Through it all, Rodrigo remained composed. He navigated small logistics as if performing an emergency procedure, telling the band to lower the volume, arranging for an exit strategy for Beatriz's parents to leave without interviews, directing the florist to repackage arrangements to give to family. Tonight he was a man in command of details no one else seemed willing to manage. He did not make a show of heroics. He offered quiet competence, the sort that did not draw attention but did stabilize chaos. At one point, while Beatriz stood near the punch bowl, someone from a local paper, he had a press badge pinned awkwardly to his chest, sidled up, pen poised. "Are you okay? Can we get a statement?" he asked, like a vulture with a polite accent. Beatriz felt the old impulse: defend, explain, justify. She had rehearsed that speech in the nights after each fight with Raphael, the defenses she now felt she debuted 1,000 times. The reasons, the why, the plan. But the energy required to be comprehensible to people who wanted the juicy part was a luxury she did not have. Rodrigo's hand found her elbow, a holding not of claim but of orientation, quickly guiding her away from the bright eyes and ushering her toward her father, who needed no instruction to keep his dignity. "You don't owe them anything," Rodrigo said, low so only she could hear. It was not a comfort, it was a fact, and she held it like a lifeline. She needed the life preserver. She had chosen it. They retreated to an oversized car that had been secured earlier, Rodrigo speaking with the driver in clipped tones while Beatriz's father settled into the seat aside him. They moved through the wet heat of the late afternoon into the hush of a private lane where the press had not yet followed. Halfway through the brake lights and the wash of the city, Beatriz finally allowed herself to crumble, the small curve of a weep that had no theater to it. No sound, just the salt and the wetness on her cheek. Rodrigo did not ask her to tell him what had happened. He sat with her silence. Later, after they had reached a suite at the hotel, a room with a view the city could not reduce to a headline, he arranged for her to see Julia, who arrived carrying a bag of clothes and a scalding cup of coffee. The three of them sat in the dimness and made an inventory of the facts: Raphael's message, the camera's footage, the signed license that lay now in a folder on the front desk. "He's tied his name to us now," Julia said, fingers working through a loop of her hair. "Is that legal? Can we even do that without—" "It is legal," Rodrigo answered. He had turned into the man you consulted for facts, as if the world were his ledger. They signed a marriage license. Father Martin is there to witness. That makes it a valid ceremony until it's undone.
How do you undo it? Julia asked, a small panic in her voice. Rodrigo's jaw worked. We hire counsel. We can pursue an annulment if there's a clear legal path, but sometimes annulments are limited and judges are particular. Failing that, we file for divorce and accept that the process will take time, months, possibly. No one is forging anything. We will be transparent with counsel. We'll be honest with HR at her firm. We will manage the narrative. Beatriz sat still and listened to the plan as if it were a recipe for a complicated cake. She liked that he spoke in measures and timelines. It felt like structure beneath the chaos. But the legalese also landed like a cold sheet across her chest. Yes, the license had been signed. Yes, the ceremony made them married in the eyes of the state until proven otherwise. That meant that to the world, she might be married to someone who had not been her choice. It meant that others could misinterpret what had needed to be an act as something else. It meant that the tabloids might call it a scandal, her scandal. She felt an urge to gather the threads of her life and wind them around her like armor. What are our boundaries, she asked finally, for the firm, for appearances, for everything else? He looked at her then with a softness that surprised her. You decide them, he repeated. I will follow them. I will ensure your autonomy is preserved. I will not weaponize my position against you. If you tell me to keep distance, I will. If you tell me to be visible, I will. We'll set these together. She believed him, partly because she had to, and partly because the evidence agreed.
In the 3 days that followed, he kept his word. He arranged for an attorney, Lina Morales, a brisk woman with appetite for solving knots, who met with Beatriz and explained legal options in plain language. An annulment depends on the grounds you can prove, Lina said, sliding a stapled packet across the coffee table. If you can show fraud, duress, or incapacity at the time of the ceremony, an annulment might be possible, but courts are not always generous. Otherwise, a no-fault divorce is straightforward in terms of cause, but still involves court filings and timelines. These things take time. Prepare for months. Beatriz nodded, because the alternative, pretending the law did not exist, felt like a fantasy. They filed what they needed with precision. Rodrigo's assistant, with an efficiency that felt intrusive at first, arranged press management to deflect speculation toward personal matters and away from crude narratives. At work, Rodrigo briefed the executive team. There would be no special favors, no rearrangement of reporting lines, no perception of impropriety. That's the most important piece, Rodrigo said in a closed-door meeting with the senior partners. We don't allow gossip to influence the perceptions of competence. Beatriz's workload and assignments remain unchanged. Any questions about conflict of interest go to HR for review. We will be transparent. Promotion decisions will be documented and based on merits they can all see. On Monday, she walked into the office as if she were stepping into a globe of eyes, into a place where whispers rustled like paper. She had chosen to return because she had agency over that choice. She had picked her jacket and her shoes and her rhythm for the day as if these were props in a play she would direct. Still, there were people who looked at her in ways that made her feel like a specimen. Phones angled. People said in the low hum of office talk things they did not mean to be cruel, but which had the quiet cruelty of the curious. She felt small. She felt the press of being watched. Rodrigo's presence was a double-edged thing. It stopped some comments, yes, because power tends to quiet certain conversations. He sent a memo outlining professional expectations and instituted a rapid rotation so that no one could quietly attribute shifts to favoritism. He did not hover. He did not come to her desk and make pronouncements. Instead, he held a meeting with HR, making sure everything was documented. Recusal from decisions where there could be an appearance of impropriety, transparency on reporting lines, and a commitment to objective measures of performance. "You're not handing me any favors," Beatriz told him at one point, standing at the edge of the conference room with a plastic cup of coffee in hand. "That's not my style," he said. His answer was not a deflection, it was a fact. "You deserve what you earn." The weeks after the wedding-turned-performance were a choreography of distance and inevitability. They had agreed, actually agreed that for 6 months they would keep the public narrative steady and then proceed with legal processes that would either annul or dissolve the marriage depending on counsel's advice. It was practical, a buffer against the immediate surge of gossip, and time to choose with clearer heads. Beatrix had insisted on the time frame. She needed an endpoint to the charade, something finite to anchor her. Inside the office, the chatter ebbed and surged like weather. Some people were quietly supportive, others speculated in corners. She learned who could be trusted by measuring the firmness of their eyes when they looked at her. Julia visited on weekends, bringing homemade soup and a sympathetic rage that could be useful in small doses. Her father, who at first seemed older in his grief, began to manage the questioners with a dignity that rediscovered itself. And Rodrigo continued to do what he had done best, manage details. It wasn't that he was always present. Most days he stayed his distance, an intentional move they had both insisted upon. But sometimes work required proximity. Sometimes clients demanded face-to-face meetings where they would expect to see an executive partnership reflected in the boardroom. On those days, they appeared together, professional and unremarkable. Their conversations were about deliverables and not about vows. They rehearsed that line like the actors they had become. The thaw, when it started, came in increments. The first was small and domestic and utterly without fanfare. A container of soup left on her desk the morning she forgot to eat between back-to-back meetings. It was left on a post-it with a single word, eat. The handwriting was not Rodrigo's. It was precise and anonymous, the assistant's note perhaps, but the delivery had been orchestrated from his suite above the city. She ate the soup, not because of obligation, but because a mundane kindness had the effect of someone handing her a hot hand in the middle of winter, and that hand warmed more than her stomach. Another smallness came at a charity gala 3 weeks later. Their firm had sponsored a table, and Beatrix found herself seated next to Rodrigo. Conversations around them were gentle, full of the surface-level politeness required by these events. At a certain point, the program struck a discordant note when a journalist launched a question about the mayoral relationship, a spiteful jibe that suggested politics-filled narratives to undeserving ears. Rodrigo's jaw tightened, and the small movement it made was like the hinge of a door closing. He gently turned the conversation, offering a firm statement about respect and privacy. Then, after the crowd's attention deflected to drinks and the overhead piano, he reached across the table and tucked a napkin into the collar of her dress where she had spilled wine in a distracted moment. The gesture was small, intimate in the ordinary way of tending to stains, and it hovered between practicality and tenderness. Beatriz found herself noticing and then cataloging these small acts. They were not dramatic rescues. They were not declarations. They were like lanterns set along a path, enough to guide her, but not to blind her. He did not assume intimacy. He respected the boundaries they had set. He would keep his distance in public, follow her lead in social settings, and step up where discretion could cushion the sting of an intruding world. There were other tests. A coworker, Maya, who had been with the firm 7 years and carried a thready bitterness that had little to do with Beatrice, made an offhand remark at the elevator one morning. "So what does it feel like to have your boss as your husband, practically?" There was a laughter in the question, but its blade was pity. Beatriz looked at her calmly, as if their conversation were a spreadsheet she was auditing. "I don't have a husband," she said. "Not right now. I'm married on paper until counsel advises otherwise." The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical sigh. Maya's discomfort shone and then faded. The moment passed, but it collected like a sediment at the edges of days, little deposits of tension that demanded tending. Rodrigo's willingness to protect did not come without cost. There were meetings where he had to answer for perceived impropriety. There were boardroom questions about judgment. There were whispers of power and seduction. Each time, he took the blow in ways that were not theatrical. He simply clarified positions, produced documentation, and accepted whatever professional consequences followed. When a rumor suggested favoritism over a promotion for a junior manager, he instructed HR to publish the criteria and metrics used for the decision. By doing so, he invited a level of scrutiny most executives avoid.
And, by doing so, he possibly protected Beatriz. It did not feel like a rescue. It felt like a payment for a choice he had made when he had walked down that aisle. In private, their conversations became sparse and sharper. They were efficient people, and emotion was a currency they spent parsimoniously. One night, after a long day of charts and client calls, Beatriz came home to find her small kitchen lit softly. There was a bag of groceries on her counter, things she liked, the green-labeled olive oil, the heavy bread the baker at the corner sold on Thursdays. And, folded atop the shopping, a note in Rodrigo's blunt script: "Call me if you need anything." She could have crumpled it like paper and burned it. Instead, she made soup, and when her phone vibrated, she let it ring and then answered. "How's the city?" he asked, sounding absurdly casual for someone who had orchestrated one of the most jarring days of her life. "Quiet," she said, "for now." "Good," he said. "Try to sleep, and I'll make sure Lena calls you tomorrow at 9.
"You're treating me like a client," she said, half accusing, half grateful. "You're a person," he corrected. "Different thing." There it was, an unadorned sentence that staked a boundary and an obligation. He could have been patronizing. He chose not to be. It was during one of those late nights, when the city outside her window had been scrubbed to a soft wash of light, and the noise from the street had settled, that they finally spoke in a way that was not about the business of unmaking a marriage or about logistic contortions. It was raw and small, a conversation about origins. "I didn't expect this," Beatriz said, stirring the soup she had made, watching steam lift in thread-like spirals. "I didn't expect any of this." Rodrigo sat across the tiny table, hands folded, the light picking out the angled plane of his cheek. He confessed nothing dramatic. He revealed a small thing, that his mother had been sick once, years ago, and that he had learned to keep certain parts of himself contained because they hurt too much to display. It wasn't a show of vulnerability meant to seduce her. It was a factual unspooling, as if he trusted her to receive it without weaponizing it. "You hold your feeling the way you hold your calendar," she said, half smiling. "And you," he answered, "you turn everything into lists so it won't scare you." They both laughed then, the kind of small laughter that unanchors the body from its tension. For one unguarded hour, they were not employer and employee, not bride and proposition, not public spectacle. They were two people who had been pulled into someone else's moral punt and were attempting to recompose themselves afterward. This was the first time Beatriz considered that the line between performance and authenticity might blur. That small hour did not alter the terms of their agreement. It merely added a texture. She was not naive enough to think a soup and a conversation could erase the complex ethical contours of their situation. She had insisted on boundaries and on preserving agency. She kept them. But she was also a person who, after months of solitude, found the fact of another's quiet attention oddly soothing. There were nights when that attention arrived as a simple, serviceable thing: legal documents read and explained aloud over dinner, a message left on her voicemail clearing a rumor, a guarded conversation in which he told a particularly persistent journalist to stop calling her parents at 11 p.m. There were moments when he was merely present, competent and unshowy. There were other moments, rare and sharper, when he apologized for inconveniencing her with his intrusion into the most personal day of her life. He never framed it as heroism, he framed it as consequence. He might have offered a crossing into the role of rescuer, but he insisted, always, on operating within the principles she demanded on that altar: her agency. He would not take her choices from her. And yet, the city had a way of making narratives out of kindness. Social feeds bloomed with images from the ceremony. Photos that had once been private, arranged into versions that seemed like commentary. The chill of a polite kiss, the gaze of a man who appeared both remote and oddly possessive, the woman whose face had been a ledger of shock and then of resolve. The headlines used words like mystery and drama and power. Friends texted with a mixture of sympathy and a curiosity that felt like speculation. There was, as always, a price to being observed. Weeks later, a message arrived from Raphael. He wanted to talk. He claimed the absence had been an act of cowardice spurred by a panic about commitment. He said he had been overwhelmed and that he wanted to apologize. He suggested a coffee, a chance to explain, and perhaps to reclaim something he'd broken. Beatriz read the message, felt the old quick flash of anger at his effrontery, and then a deeper fatigue. She had rehearsed a conversation like this in the scaffolded spaces of the nights. The words she would say, the refusal she would make. She could imagine being tender in a way that did not accept him back. She could imagine no redemption for the 3 words he had sent. She put the phone down for a long time, letting the message sit like a stone in the small pond of her life. Then, when she picked it up again, she typed with machinery she could not feel as a softness. No. Do not contact my family again. Do not contact me again. She sent it before she could change her mind. That moment was clarifying. It was the cutting of a thread that had allowed her to float. The door she had allowed some of herself to linger before closed with an echo. There would be other complicating presences, other tests, but closing that chapter was an act that belonged to her and to her alone. The next day, Rodrigo arrived at work with a new set of files and a lawyer's number tucked into his phone like a talisman. He walked to her desk, found her typing and looking more composed than she felt. He dropped a packet where only she could see it, a summary of the conversations he'd had with press and with counsel that morning. He said softly, "You're doing what you should do. I won't interfere." She believed him, and in believing him she felt that curious soreness of someone whose life had been amended and reshaped by an act of unlikely mercy. She was not naive about the future. She had already read the legal disclaimers, the counsel's cautioning words about timelines, and the court's strange appetite for evidence. She knew the months ahead might be rough, full of intrusions, of questions that were not hers to answer, and of the slow, bureaucratic machinery that would decide whether the marriage would be annulled or reluctantly divorced. Still, in the neutral center of the storm, there were quiet minutes that suggested possibility.
They were little things. Rodrigo's hand finding the edge of her sleeve to steady her at a crowded reception. A message left at 9 p.m. saying, "Call me if you can't sleep." And, in the privacy of her apartment, a conversation about a childhood dog and the consolation of city parks. These were not declarations. They were attentions, small and tentative. Beatriz catalogued them, weighed them, allowed them to exist without naming them. The strain of pretending continued. Sometimes she slipped. Once, in a staff meeting, when someone credited her for a project she'd led, a woman asked with a raised eyebrow whether favoritism had played any role. The question hung like a small guillotine. Beatriz answered, measured and precise. The project metrics and results, the documented process, and the team that had executed it. She said nothing of the marriage's farce or of the nights she had spent crying into the phone. Professionalism became her language and also her armor. At home, however, the armor wore thin. There were nights when she would sit at the window and watch headlights draw slow lines across the street below, and feel a loneliness that the world did not have words for. Then there would be a text, "Are you eating?" and she would feel the strange duality of gratitude and small, discreet apprehension. That twofoldity settled into her, shaped by the realities of a life that had been pushed into a new configuration. She gave herself time to observe how she felt about it. One night, on the 3rd week after the ceremony, they broke a rule they'd imposed. They had agreed, explicitly, that nothing intimate would happen, because everything private could be misconstrued as proof of something the world wanted to believe. They had also agreed to remain honest with one another. On that night, she left the office late, worn from a day of defending decisions and smoothing problems. Rodrigo left later and, by mutual agreement, drove her home to her small apartment. They had agreed on this as a courtesy on nights when her commute would be dangerous. It wasn't about possession, it was about safety. He walked her to the door. The hallway was half lit. The building hummed with domestic sounds. A piano practiced in the unit below, the muffled tap of TV dialogue. At her door they paused. The world smelled of rain and warmed metal. Rodrigo stood a half step too close. The air between them tightened. "Do you ever regret doing this?" she asked, the question tumbling out because the proximity made asking it necessary. He looked at her then, in a way he rarely had in public, disarmed and earnest. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I regret that your day had to be the way it was. I regret that any of this happened to you." "Not that you stood up," she clarified. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet, and it touched something she didn't know lived in him. "No, I don't regret stepping in. It was the right thing."
There was a pause long enough to cause both of them discomfort. Then motion intervened. He reached out, not to claim, but to steady, and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. It was a domestic, unremarkable gesture, the sort of thing couples do by rote. And in the way ordinary things sometimes have the power of revelation, that small touch slid across the fissure they'd built between them and found a place to rest. Beatriz felt coolness at first, then a warmth that was disorienting because it arrived without alarms. She remembered their agreement. She had made it. She held its edges. She could pull back. She did not pull back. Instead, she stepped toward him a fraction, enough to admit a possibility without naming it. They stood breathing, the door between them a thin membrane. Then, as if remembering the line they'd both sworn to keep, Rodrigo stepped back, hands raised in a manner that was almost comical in its apologetic precision. "I shouldn't," he said, the sentence unfinished because he needed a reason for the retreat. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, surprising herself with her steadiness, "but thank you for asking." They parted then with a courtesy and a tacit understanding. The world had not shifted into a new shape. But in the subtle place where their hands had touched, a filament had been lit. It might endure, it might snap, it might be nothing more than a small warmth in the night. She did not yet know. She only knew that the story that had started with 3 words and a whisper had not finished. It had only begun to reroute her life. When she shut the door, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Julia. "Are you okay?" followed by 3 heart emojis. In the space of minutes, the narrative the world wanted to tell, scandal, pity, triumph, had been blurred by other things. The night after Julia's text, Beatriz lay awake until the city blurred into a wash of lights and she stopped trying to count the minutes. The small filament Rodrigo had lit, when he tucked a curl behind her ear, hummed under her skin, like a thing with its own heat. She told herself the rules out loud. 6 months, legal counsel, distance when necessary. And the rules held for days, like anchors. Then the rules loosened in the way rules always do when people are tired and human. A misplaced laugh in a staff meeting, a shared elevator ride in rain, the inevitability of being 2 people who wanted to be helpful and found it easy to be near one another. The world outside continued to do what the world does, spin headlines, fill comments with speculation, turn grief into gossip. But inside the tiny orbit they shared, small mercies accrued. It began, as so many turning points do, with kindness that did not ask for a name. On a cold morning in November, after a long week that felt like the entire courthouse had been moved into her inbox, Beatriz found a thermos on her desk. Steam crowned the lid. There was a post-it, hot, from Rodrigo. No flourish, no sign of ownership. She opened it in the privacy of her office, took one cautious sip, and felt the edge of the week blur. The second fissure in the wall between them came at the firm's annual retreat, a weekend of strategy sessions and small talk designed to make executives look like a family. They had agreed, strictly, to avoid impropriety at such events. They were professionals. They would be seen. Yet during a late-night wrap in the hotel lounge, after presentations and a dinner that tried to normalize them, an argument about a client's ethics lapsed into something quieter. Rodrigo and Beatriz were the only ones up. The rest of the floor slept or pretended to. "You carry weight like it's a design flaw," Rodrigo said, not unkindly. He folded his hands around his cup as if protecting it. Beatriz shrugged, the motion small. "I make lists so the world won't surprise me," she said. "I like having the edges of things." "You have good edges," he replied. "You cut through nonsense without apologizing."
She didn't know whether to accept the compliment, and so she deflected with a humor she didn't feel. That's one way to put it. Silence settled like a comfortable chair between them. Then, because there are moments that steer two people who have already stepped onto an unsure path, she said, "Did you ever want a different life? A softer one?" Rodrigo's answer came after a pause that made the room feel like a sealed bubble. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've found ways to make it livable." "Is that how you survive?" she asked, groping for the contour of him underneath the efficient suit. "By making plans that are so tight they stop hurting you." He looked at her then with an attention that was altogether too honest. "I learned early that if I felt everything, I would break. So I learned containment. Then I learned that containment can become a habit someone mistakes for strength." There was something in the way he said it, an unadorned fact, not a drama, that unmoored something in her. She reached out, impulsively, and laid the back of her hand against his wrist. The touch was warm and real, and neither of them pulled away in reflexive alarm. The contact said what words rarely did: "We are both more fractured than we appear." "Do you ever wish you could do something reckless?" she asked. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "I try not to wish recklessly," he said, but his eyes softened. They left the lounge together because that was the logical thing: sleep, rest, pretend normalcy. And on the walk back to their rooms, with the corridor carpet swallowing sound, they paused near the stairwell. There was a tenderness between them that had nothing to do with showmanship. It had boundaries and permission and the sober intention to be honest afterward. "Are you sure about all of this?" she asked. "About us? About what we promised?" He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time in months. "I'm sure about the promise to be honest."
I'm sure I promise not to make choices for you, and I'm sure I don't like lying to myself anymore. That small, blunt confession was as much an invitation as a revelation. She stepped closer. There was no script, no audience. The world shrank to the stairwell, their shoes, and the breath they shared. When he reached out this time, he did not merely tuck a curl away. His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing the side of her cheek with a deliberation that asked permission. She felt the question in that movement: "Did you want this?" And she answered with her eyes before her lips moved. She tilted, a cautious, sovereign inclination, and when their mouths met, it was neither a spectacle nor a conquest. It was an honest thing, brief and tremulous, a meeting of two people who had finally allowed themselves an unguarded moment. She pulled back first, breath shallow. "We have rules," she reminded him, because they were both adults, and because rules, once agreed upon, are not to be erased by a single rush of feeling. "We do," he agreed, hands still on her, voice steady. "And we'll keep them. This," he swallowed, "doesn't change what we said, but it does change what I know." They walked back to their rooms with the knowledge of that kiss tucked between them like a fragile thing to be handled with care. Beatriz felt complicated, guilty, exhilarated, fearful, alive. The rules remained, but they now had a crack where light could enter. The crack widened with time. It widened with good mornings and with the quiet practicalities of living when life needed to be put back together. Rodrigo insisting on paying for a lock changed on her apartment after she discovered a lingering reporter outside. Rodrigo arguing with a supplier to make sure her family's seating at a memorial service wasn't photographed for clickbait. He offered no speeches, he offered actions. He kept stepping into the perimeter she set and then withdrawing when she asked. He continued to insist she kept her agency. Still, despite his decency, the external world would not be placated by the smallness of their private evolution. One morning, Lena called and asked to meet in person. They sat in her office with the city visible through the glass wall, a rectangle of sky like a stage light. Lena's expression was crisp, her notebook open, words neat. "We have a development," she said. "The filings are ready.
The court clerk has set preliminary dates. Given the jurisdiction, if we proceed with a no-fault divorce, there will be a sequence of hearings and a waiting period. If we pursue an annulment, we will need to develop strong grounds, fraud, duress, incapacity. Both routes require time and documentation. There is also the practical matter of public perception. If you choose not to move forward right now, there are risks. The press interprets delay as either reconciliation or strategy. If you move forward, they will parse every step.
You both need to decide what you want, because the law will move at its own pace once motions are filed. Beatriz listened. The legal reality felt like another instrument in the orchestra. It produced notes she had to play no matter the music she wanted. She had expected guidance from Lena. Instead, she received the law's steady voice, impersonal and inevitable. "What if we stop?" Rodrigo asked, quietly. "What if we put the filings on hold?" Lena looked at him with a professional caution that was almost maternal. "You can delay, technically, by not filing, but the marriage remains on record. Another fact, some courts will not be friendly to a marriage intentionally contracted under false pretenses. There's also the matter of permanence in certain legal contexts: banks, property, tax filings. The longer you wait, the more other systems will begin to assume the marriage is real. If you want to preserve unwritten dignity, then prompt legal action is usually better. If you want to keep some kind of public buffer, delaying has its own costs." Beatriz and Rodrigo met each other's eyes, and, for a long second, the world narrowed to that exchange. He leaned forward. "We need to be honest with ourselves," he said. "We made a pragmatic choice in the church to protect you. We promised to be transparent with counsel. If there is any chance that the feeling between us is not an artifact of pity or obligation, then we should not wait for bureaucratic timing to decide the truth for us. The legal reality is one thing, our private answer is another." Beatriz regarded him. The choice, his admission, folded her into wondering. Was she allowing a rescue to become a refuge? Was she confusing safety for love? She listed quietly the small items: his steady presence, the way he reframed gossip by producing facts, the nights he sat without offering advice while she cried, the way he had defended her at the gala. She also remembered his efficiency, the way he had always counted consequences. "I don't know if it's love," she said. "I know I don't want to be married to an idea someone else conjured for me. I don't want to be someone's story when I'm trying to be a person." "Then let's be honest," he said. "If we move forward, let's do it honestly. No hiding, no pretending. If we don't, then we file, but let's not let the law decide for us." They left Lena with more questions than answers, only a clearer picture that the legal path would be messy whichever route they took. In those messy weeks that followed, they tried to live honestly. The kiss became a remembered thing, an event with consequences. They spoke more openly, about childhoods, about betrayal, and what it meant to rebuild. He told her, in a way that felt deliberate and not performative, about a sister he had once failed to call during a hospitalization, and how that absence still echoed. "I don't know if it's love," she said. "I know I don't want to be married to an idea someone else conjured for me. I don't want to be someone's story when I'm trying to be a person." "Then let's be honest," he said. "If we move forward, let's do it honestly. No hiding, no pretending. If we don't, then we file, but let's not let the law decide for us." They left Lena with more questions than answers, only a clearer picture that the legal path would be messy whichever route they took. In those messy weeks that followed, they tried to live honestly. The kiss became a remembered thing, an event with consequences. They spoke more openly, about childhoods, about betrayal, and what it meant to rebuild. He told her, in a way that felt deliberate and not performative, about a sister he had once failed to call during a hospitalization, and how that absence still echoed. She told him about nights she had sat in spreadsheets measuring dreams and wondering where passion would fit inside a life of competence. One slow Sunday afternoon, as winter made the city hard and gray, Rodrigo arrived at her door with a bag of groceries and a small parcel wrapped in plain paper. She let him in. They sat on the floor of her living room on cushions, and he made them coffee. The parcel contained a small, used cookbook with notes in the margin. "My mother used to cook from this," he said. "I thought maybe you'd like it." Beatriz touched the spine, then looked at him. "You keep doing these things that remind me you are not a performance," she said. "Good," he said, and for once the answer was simple satisfaction rather than strategy. They ate quietly. Conversation drifted and landed on small promises. She told him she was tired of being the protagonist of other people's gossip. He promised, with an air of ridiculous solemnity, to refuse interviews on her behalf. She laughed because it sounded absurdly adolescent, and then leaned back to listen to the sound of him talking about a childhood dog that had only ever eaten socks. The intimacy of that moment was not explosive. It was domestic, the kind that seeds long-term living. It was in the hum of these ordinary scenes that their relationship deepened into something neither had planned, and both felt in private like a fragile blessing. They still kept their 6-month line as an outer perimeter. They still agreed on boundaries at work. They still refused to let the state of their private affairs be fodder for others. But the heart, the messy, stubborn muscle, reoriented itself. Then the paperwork arrived. It was a morning like any other when Lena called with a tone that was without theatrics. "The draft is ready," she said. Someone at the clerk's office asked a question that necessitated filing preliminary documentation. "If you don't want to proceed, we can hold before the file is made public. But there's also a vector we need to address. The state requires that financial disclosures and certain initial affidavits be filed. They are asking for signatures." Beatriz sat hard enough that her chair scraped the tile. The legal machinery she had been watching now had a sprocket that needed her hand. The prospect of signing away a marriage that had, however far from intention, become entangled with her life made the inside of her feel like an empty room. She called Rodrigo. He was at the office, midday, the kind of late morning when he scaled decisions he felt were small but heavy. His voice sounded steady. He met her at the firm in 20 minutes. They went to a conference room where papers sat in a neat stack like accusations. Lena and an administrative assistant were there. "These are the preliminary documents," Lena said. "They include the petition for divorce and the standard disclosures. Both parties must sign to avoid default judgment. Otherwise, the process begins without your input. You can sign to move forward, or you can refuse to sign now and instruct counsel to take different steps. Legally, it would not prevent proceedings from starting in some jurisdictions, but it would alter the posture." Rodrigo looked at Beatriz with a kind of raw, visible fear. "What do you want?" he asked, simply. She felt the room lean toward the word. She had thought about it all night. She thought of the kiss in the stairwell, the soup left on her desk, the way he had rearranged the world to protect her. She also thought of the life she had been planning before the 3 words had split her story into before and after. She had agency in this, every step, every signature, and she wanted honesty. "I don't want to sign," she said. The words surprised even her. "Not because I think this will solve anything legally, but because I don't want a piece of paper to dictate whether what I'm feeling is real." Rodrigo's face folded into an expression she had not often seen, a vulnerability stripped of executive polish. He reached for her hand and squeezed it. "I don't want you to sign either," he admitted. "I don't want this to be undone because of procedure, when what we have, if it's real, is worth being tested outside of courtrooms and headlines." Lena, professional as ever, adjusted. "If you choose not to sign, we will place a hold and document your intent. There are consequences. The marriage will remain legally reported. Some institutions might operate as though the marriage is valid, and your public narrative will be ambiguous. But the most important thing is you make the decision that aligns with your values." They decided, together, to place a hold.
They asked Lena to file a notice of intent, to secure a temporary legal posture that would prevent a hostile filing but not pretend everything was finished. It was a compromise, a pause that could become a path. The choice did not stop the world from speculating. If anything, the ambiguity fueled gossip. But for Beatriz, the ambiguity felt less like a danger and more like a space where truth might grow. She had chosen, and for the first time since the church, she felt the buoyancy of deciding. The more private consequences of that decision were no less complex. They began to carry the weight of their small intimacy, like a shared instrument. They found ways to be together that were not performances. A Saturday afternoon repairing the lamp in her living room, an argument about who used more olive oil, a slow dance in the kitchen to a song that came on the radio. They learned each other's rhythms. Their honest affection bled into the office through the unavoidable channels of visibility.
There was a moment, one that should have been small and private, but became public because someone recorded it with a phone, of Rodrigo arriving at the firm late one night and Beatriz stepping out of the elevator wiping her hands on a paper towel. He touched the corner of her mouth with his thumb, an absent, affectionate gesture, and someone caught it on camera. The clip spread. For a day, their private world looked like a headline. Rodrigo addressed it the next morning, as he had addressed other rumors, with transparency and principle. He asked for a meeting of the senior staff and, in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, laid out what he had always insisted upon. "I want to be clear," he said. "Beatriz is a remarkable leader. Any decisions about her role, promotions, or assignments will be handled by a committee with documented criteria. I will recuse myself from any review that directly affects her career progression. Transparency is the antidote to rumor." He then did something that surprised some of the board. He announced a proposed change to the promotion process that would require documented, objective KPIs and a committee vote for senior hires. He placed the new policy on the agenda for immediate ratification. It was a risky move, opening himself to scrutiny and formalizing what might otherwise have been done quietly. But it had the effect he wanted. The policy curbed whispers and created a public record. When, 2 months later, a senior manager position opened for a project Beatriz had led from start to finish, the committee followed the new process. Her dossier, metrics, client testimonials, deliverables, was evaluated against objective benchmarks. She was promoted. The news spread, and for the first time since the church, the headline read not about a personal scandal, but about competence and merit. Rodrigo watched from the sidelines, not because he needed to be proven right, but because the gesture of transparency had been his way of aligning his power with her agency. In a company meeting where he announced the promotion, he did something he rarely did in public. He spoke about her accomplishments and then directly addressed the staff. "We've been through a moment," he said. "We chose to handle it with openness and with rules. Beatriz earned this promotion. The process and the decision will be documented. If anyone has concerns about fairness, present them to HR." There was a murmur and then applause. The applause was not the same as the priest's benediction. It was work applause, earned and slightly more satisfying. The promotion did not stop everyone from gossiping, but it shifted the tone. She was no longer just a spectacle. She was a leader whose results were visible. That structural change, more than private vows, began to recalibrate how the company regarded her. Then Raphael reappeared. He reached out first with a cautious email, then a voicemail, then a text asking for a meeting. He apologized with the practiced tone of someone who had expected forgiveness to be easy. He explained his panic, his sudden fright at commitment, his fear at becoming less of himself inside a shared life. He wanted to talk. He wanted to be forgiven. Beatriz arranged to meet him in a small cafe far from both their neighborhoods. She told Rodrigo she would do it and asked for no counsel or commentary. He listened, eyes steady, and nodded. "You decide what you need," he said. "I'm here if you want support." Across the table, Raphael looked like someone who had swallowed too much late regret. He had the easy charm he had used before and the physical memory of intimacy that had been yoked to days of planning and ordinary life. But his apology did not carry shock, it carried a pattern she'd already seen. "I panicked," he said, hands folded. "I thought, marriage is a kind of death. I thought I'd lose myself." "You left me at the altar," she said. The words landed clean and small. She had practiced them in the quiet between meetings. They had the gravity of a statement that both freed and closed. "I know," he said. "I know I hurt you. I want to explain." "There's nothing to explain that undoes it," she said. "You sent 3 words. You do not get to ask for a second show after that." He leaned forward, a last act of pleading. "Please, can we at least talk, for closure?" She considered. Closure was a private economy. Sometimes you had to give to move on. But there was a boundary she would not cross. She would not let him ask for kindness while he had chosen cowardice. "No," she said, and the word was a small clearing. "There's nothing left to talk about. We are done." He swallowed, the realization of a permanent boundary catching him mid-breath. There was hurt there, his, and also a recognition that his choices had created a fact. He left the cafe without another attempt. When he sent a final, short message, "I'm sorry," she did not respond. She had given him the space he needed when he had chosen the door. Now she closed it herself. After he left the scene of her life, the world began to settle into a kind of new honesty. Beatriz and Rodrigo's relationship continued to navigate the legal and the private. They met with Lena and with HR to ensure all documentation and recusal statements were in place in the firm. Rodrigo continued to recuse himself from decisions that would personally benefit Beatriz. His promotion of her had been the committee, the metrics, the transparent process. It left no room for accusations. He accepted whatever professional consequences came for being visible, because it was part of the price of walking down that first aisle. And then, one evening in early spring, with the city awake but the firm quiet after an earnings report, Rodrigo invited her to his apartment, not to perform, not to soothe, but to be present.
He had cooked a simple meal, which in itself was an oddity. A man who usually ordered in had spent an afternoon learning to make a dish his mother used to make. They ate at his kitchen island, footsteps muffled, the city muffled beyond the glass. There were no cameras. There was no script. They shared small talk and then fell into a comfortable silence. After dessert, Rodrigo stood and, without dramatics, reached into a drawer and produced an envelope. He slid it across the marble. "I've been thinking about how we started," he said, "about what we promised each other, honesty, agency, transparency, about how much I misread my own life. I don't want to pretend anymore." Beatriz looked at the envelope, at him. "What's that?" she asked. "It's a resignation," he said. "Not from the firm, from a life I kept because it was safe. I thought stepping away would cost too much. But the truth is, I keep trying to arrange other people's lives as if mine were a spreadsheet I could balance. I'm not sure that's a life worth keeping unless I'm willing to be in it honestly, with someone I care about." She felt the room tilt. The confession wasn't theatrical. It was a small, brave thing. He had taken a professional risk, and he was saying, plainly, that his life could be different. He paused. "What I'm trying to say more directly is, there are papers out there, and we can let the law decide, or we can decide together. I don't want to be the man who stepped into your worst moment and then retreated into a superior solitude. I don't want to pretend for the sake of comfort. I want to ask you, properly, will you marry me? Not as a fix to what happened at the church, not as an answer to the press, but as a conscious, informed choice with everything on the table." The question landed like a stone thrown into still water. It made a ripple that reached the shore of everything they'd been building: the soup, the lawyers, the promotion, the nights they had shared. It contained risk and clarity in equal measure. Beatriz's breath hitched. She felt the weight of the papers they'd not yet signed, the months that had given them room to learn each other, the dignity she had fought to preserve on that altar the first night.
This was not a man buying her future, it was a man asking to share one. She considered, because that is what she did: list, weigh, decide. She thought of her father and how his hand had tightened on hers in the church, of Julia and the neighborly kindness that kept her anchored, of Lena's counsel that suggested legal steps could not define the heart. She thought of herself and of the life she wanted, one where she was not only competent but loved in the messy way people are loved when they allow it. Will there be conditions, she asked finally, because even in the face of vulnerability, she needed specifics. He nodded. Absolutely. Transparency with the firm, full recusal where needed, legal counsel on everything, no secrecy.
And a promise that whatever we do it because we choose it, not because the world demands it of us. Okay, she said. She could have said many things. Yes, maybe, I'm not sure. But she chose clarity. I will marry you if we do it on our terms, if we do it honestly. He laughed, a small relieved sound, and then reached across the table. This time, when their mouths met, it was not a cautious thing. It was a kiss that acknowledged the past and leaned into the possibility of the future. They both consented, openly, with the steadiness of adults who had made 1,000 small decisions to get to this one. They told Lena the next morning. The lawyer, practical and efficient, smiled with the relief of someone whose job is to make life less perilous. If you're both decided, she said, we can proceed with a clean slate. We will file a mutual statement that you intend to reconcile and that any prior acts at the ceremony were non-fraudulent but inadvertent. If you choose to convert the temporary legal posture into a real marriage, there are filing steps. We will need to withdraw any petition for divorce, if filed, and file for any changes accordingly. There will be some paperwork, but the legal system is procedural. Your personal decision is the heart of it. They moved deliberately. There were no shows, no instant proclamations. They planned a small private ceremony for family, proper, with vows chosen and rehearsed because Beatriz wanted words that were hers and not lines read for an emergency. They invited Julia, Beatriz's father, and a few close friends. The firm would learn, of course, because transparency had been their contract with the world. Before the ceremony, however, there had to be one more public act. Rodrigo would make a statement at the firm. He wanted the record to reflect not only his relationship, but also the policies they'd put in place. He wanted his colleagues to know the promotion had followed the new rules. He wanted the company to be a safer place afterward. He scheduled a town hall. The room packed. People were curious and some resentful. He started with a fact list. Policies implemented, recusal statements filed, the promotion process explained. Then, when the procedural dust had settled, he said something neither tidy nor rehearsed. I owed Beatriz an explanation for my entrance into her life, he said. I did what I thought was right at a moment of humiliation. I own the consequences that followed, both professional and personal. We have chosen together to move forward honestly. She is a leader in this firm because she earned it. I have recused myself from any decision that would inappropriately benefit her. That is not performative. It is the work of fairness. He paused, and the room listened with the particular attention of people who are watching a rare admission.
Then he added, for the benefit of those who needed clarity, we will not tolerate harassment or attempts to weaponize our personal life against our colleagues. If there are concerns about favoritism, bring them forward with facts. We have processes for review. It was not a speech of romantic theater. It was an executive statement. But it did something essential. It brought their private truth under the same light as the rest of their professional world. It made their relationship a fact rather than a rumor. The firm adjusted, slowly, like a ship trimming its sails. The promotion stood on merit. HR audits confirmed the records. People who had been quick to whisper now had to contend with evidence and performance.
On a bright, clear day, one of those spring days that look like a promise, Beatriz stood in a small room with sunlight on the floorboards. Rodrigo looked at her with a steadiness that made her think of the first time he had offered to be a shield in a church aisle. This time there were no whispered bargains. There were vows chosen deliberately and repeated aloud. "I promise to practice honesty with you," Rodrigo said, voice steady, "to keep my position and power from ever becoming your cage, to love you with the kind of attentiveness that shows up in small things and large, to be accountable." Beatriz listened and felt the words like threads. She had always preferred to speak with precision. Her vow was a mirror of that. "I promise to hold my own agency," she said, "to be honest when I'm afraid, to forgive when it is reasonable and refuse when it is not, to be your partner in whatever that will look like, with clarity and with courage." They signed the forms for a proper marriage this time, with signatures that were not under duress and not the product of emergency. The priest who had officiated the hasty ceremony months before watched with a soft smile, as if a wound had been set right by care rather than magic. Friends laughed quietly and cried. Julia kept wiping a sleeve at the corner of her eye. The symbolic drama of tearing at the divorce documents came later, private and tender. Lena had arranged the legal steps to withdraw any preliminary filings, to correct public records, to ensure the state recognized the marriage properly. In the quiet of their bedroom, amidst a small pile of paperwork, they made a domestic ritual of it. "Ready?" Rodrigo asked, and his fingers intertwined with hers. Beatriz nodded. They held the papers, a bureaucratic artifact of months of limbo, and together tore them in two. It was nothing to the law. Lena had done what she needed to do. But to Beatriz, it was a closing of a chapter written in shock and a reclamation of authorship. They burned nothing. They filed what the law required. The tearing was sincere and symbolic, an agreed-upon act of moving forward. In the months that followed, the couple's life softened into the ordinary, which is to say, they reclaimed the small domestic geometry of two people choosing one another. They learned each other's mornings and bad jokes and the precise way the other liked pepper on their eggs. Beatriz, now promoted, took on a larger portfolio and, true to their vow, Rodrigo recused on anything that touched her directly. When the board discussed a new venture that might have implicated her work, he sat out. He trusted the processes they had jointly established. She trusted his absence at the table as a proof of his commitment. Raphael faded into a background of occasional messages that Beatriz ignored. He contacted her father once. She asked him not to respond. He tried, in a last-ditch effort, to seek her out through mutual acquaintances. The firm politely forwarded him a statement that she did not wish to engage. He was, in the end, a lesson learned in the harshest currency. Some choices have consequences, and absence spoke louder than apology. The firm changed in small ways. The new promotion policy became the standard. People learned to argue based on data rather than gossip. The HR director implemented workshops on workplace boundaries and the ethics of power. Classes Rodrigo insisted on sponsoring. It was less about absolution and more about building a different culture, which was the point. Years later, when the story was told by someone who knew how to trim details into narrative, it lost the sharpness of the moment that had started everything. 3 words, a whisper, a choice. What remained was the fact that Beatriz had been left, had been offered an improbable rescue, and had chosen again and again to be the author of her life. Rodrigo had offered steadiness, but she had also selected him, soberly, deliberately, with terms in hand. They did not pretend the beginning had been anything other than messy. They did not sanctify Raphael's cowardice. They did not make a myth of wealth as salvation. They built a life that was uneven, tender, and honest. Promotion paperwork in between Sunday pancakes, board meetings in between school visit mornings, laughter in the small hours over burned toast and forgotten anniversaries. They learned to apologize with detail and to forgive with boundaries. They learned the hard work of being two people with separate agency choosing to combine some parts of their lives.
On an ordinary evening, years removed from the church with its lilies and its cracking organ, Beatriz stood at the sink rinsing a glass. Rodrigo came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, the gesture light and practiced. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You ever think about that day?" he asked quietly. She considered the bouquet crushed beneath the knees of a life that had once been public, and said, "Sometimes, I think I did the right thing." "You did," he said. "You always did." She turned in his arms and met his eyes. There was no audience. There was the city beyond the window and the hum of the refrigerator. She kissed him, now a kiss that had accumulated months of choice and small mercies, slow and intentional. He kissed her back in a way that answered the many small promises he had made. They had rerouted a crisis into a life neither of them could have planned on that rainy Sunday, and in the rerouting they had been careful, of law, of agencies, and of each other. In the end, the whispered line that had started the farce, "Pretend I'm the groom," became a story they could tell not as a joke, but as a turning point. It was the moment a man stepped off the back pew and a woman reclaimed her agency, and from that messy, human decision, a real partnership had been built. If this story made you wonder what you would do in a similar situation, share your thoughts below. Would you accept such a rescue, or would you walk away? And if you enjoyed this kind of slow-burn, true-to-life romance, consider subscribing for more stories where crisis reroutes life towards something honest and unexpected.